Hi, I'm Pastor Dick LaFountain, and we're ready to start our third study of Jonah. We are in chapter 2. We're going to be looking at Jonah inside the belly of the whale. Chapter 2 is really his prayer to God as he struggles with dying in the belly of the whale. You could join us online at www.ministrytoday.org. Click on the image that you see on the web page and you'll go directly to the studies. You can participate in any of our back studies. We have videos, essentially video clips of our teaching, and then we have documentation of all of the different studies that we do, including word studies, which I consider to be very important as you study the Word of God. We welcome you to join us. Today we are in chapter 2 of Jonah. Jonah is now swallowed by a whale. We're going to hear his cry to God as he struggles with a near-death experience. From Jonah chapter 2, I want to read that chapter to you so that we have the perspective in front of us. And then we're going to look at some ideas here that I think are concerning to me, but I think are applicable to all of our lives. Jonah chapter 2. Reading with verse 1. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, and said, I cried by reason of my affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me. Out of the belly of hell I cried, and you heard my voice. For you had cast me into the deep, into the midst of the sea, and the floods compassed me about, and your billows and your waves passed over me. Then I said, Oh no, I am cast out from your sight. Yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. The depth closed around about me. The weeds were wrapped around my head. I went down to the bottom of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me forever. Yet you brought my life up from corruption. O Lord my God, when my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and by prayer came unto you into your holy temple. They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy. But I will sacrifice unto you with the voice of thanksgiving. I will pay that I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited out Jonah upon the land. That's chapter 2 of Jonah. I think it's significant that we study this as a prayer that Jonah made to God while he was in the belly of the whale. To me, it's very important that you wear the story. The Bible stories are given to us as examples so that we will not repeat the same errors of the people that we're studying about. Jonah is one of those that we don't want to repeat the same errors. But I want you to jump into the story and actually put it on. You become Jonah. You become this man who is rebellious against the Lord, didn't want to go to Nineveh, decided to go as far as he could the other direction into Tarshish. So he gets on a ship and falls asleep in the hold of the ship, and there a storm besets the ship, and people are in big trouble. And so they approached Jonah and said, Why are you sleeping? Call upon your God. And you know the rest of that story. He explains that he's running from God, and the God that made the heavens and the earth and the sea is angry because he has run from him. The sailors didn't want to throw him overboard, but they ended up doing so because it was the only way to solve the problem of the stormy sea. They did so, and immediately it was calm. But Jonah falls into the water, and evidently he tumbles about in the water, and the billows, the waves go over him. He's choking on salt water. He says the seaweed wraps around his head, and then a whale comes along, or a great fish, and swallows him. And you can imagine, put yourself into this situation. It's not Pinocchio and Geppetto. They didn't have a table to write on, but he is swallowed by a whale and put inside this tank. There's probably very little light, if any at all. Some of the scientists say if the luminescence of some of the fish that were in there, which often happens with a whale, he eats fish that have a a glow to them. There might have been this greenish hue, kind of like looking through night goggles. And there he is in the whale, and he sees what's around him. He's falling down to the bottom, and he's spitting up water, and he's gasping for air, and the air that he smells is just horrible. It's the stink of rotting fish. It's a horrible place to be. He feels about himself, and he feels perhaps the ribs of the rib cage of the whale, and realizes what's going on. And now, later on, he describes this for us in chapter 2 as his prayer to the Lord. So we want you swimming with him. We want you to be in the water. We want you to go down to the depths with him and experience what Jonah experienced. Now here's the first thing I want to observe as we look at Jonah inside the belly of the whale. I've always thought Jonah inside the belly of the whale was an amazing story of God's deliverance of this man. But J. Vernon McGee, who is a great commentator and a great scholar in the Word of God, has done through the Bible for many, many years. And in his study of Jonah, he gives us a proposition that he thinks Jonah died in the belly of the whale. And the reason behind this is twofold. Number one, he says, it's more palatable for university students to swallow that Jonah was dead 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, rather than having to believe that he actually survived for 3 days and 3 nights. And then he says the second part of that is Jesus referred to Jonah on 3 different occasions. And in doing so, he always repeated the same thing, that just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale, or the great fish, for 3 days and 3 nights, so would the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. J. Vernon McGee says, to keep that parallel, and by looking at some of the words that Jonah uses here, he kind of thinks that Jonah died, and the 3rd day the Lord raised him from the dead. Now I want to argue against that, because I don't believe Jonah died. I think it defeats the whole purpose of the story to imagine that he died and he was raised to life. So we want to look at it at a different perspective. Now I have a number of notes here that are available for you online. I'm going to go rather rapidly, but you can pick up these notes at www.ministrytoday. You can follow the logic that I'm going to follow here, and I'll try to keep you up to date. I give you the references where Jesus spoke of Jonah, and that's Matthew chapter 12, Matthew chapter 16, and Luke chapter 11. All 3 echoing the same thing, that Jonah was 3 nights and 3 days in the belly of the whale, and Jesus Christ will be 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, or dead in the grave. All of that is significant in this argument that J. Vernon McGee presents. But I want to present my view on that, and that is that Jonah did not die. And I'll give you my premise for it, and you can read about J. Vernon McGee and his arguments. He gives 5. I will give you 10 arguments for why I believe Jonah did not die in the belly of the whale. The first one is in verse 2. He says, I cried to the Lord out of the belly of the fish. And he said, by reason of my suffering, I cried to the Lord out of the belly of the fish. He wasn't dead, he was suffering. And so that gives me an understanding that people that are suffering call on the Lord, but people that are dead do not call on the Lord. Number 2, same verse, out of the belly of hell I cried. J. Vernon McGee says, oh, well, there, he's in hell, so he cried to the Lord in hell. Excuse me, but somebody that's dead in hell is not talking to the Lord. He's cried out of the belly of hell, and that is a synonym. It means the same thing as out of the belly of the whale, or out of the fish's belly, and this belly becomes my personal hell. By reason of my affliction, I called unto the Lord. So there's no indication here that he is in the grave or he is dead. Number 3 is, he says, he uses terms like the deep, the seas, the floods, the waves, and the billows. All of those are very tangible, very physical, very demonstrable evidence that he is alive in the belly of the whale, experiencing all of this. And then in verse 4, he says, then I said, I am cast out of your presence. Dear Vernon McGee, love you, dear brother, but if he's cast out of the presence of the Lord, when a believer dies, he is in the presence of the Lord, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament. He is not dead just in the grave, but he is alive in the presence of God. So he wouldn't be able to say, I am cast out of your presence. Number 5 in these arguments is that in verse 5 he says, the waters, my soul, the depths closed about me, weeds, seaweeds wrapped around my neck. All of this describes a man in great stress. Certainly he was gasping for air and probably thought he was going to die. This darkness was about him, and he was feeling like he was suffocating. But that's a living man who's feeling that. He's not a dead man feeling that. The next one is in verse 6. He says, the bottoms of the mountains and the earth bars are still holding on to me forever. In other words, he's in this belly of the whale. Perhaps he can see a little bit, but at least he can touch the rib cage of the whale. And he senses the bars of the earth have hemmed me in. I am trapped here. Not saying that he's dead. He's saying I'm very much alive, but I'm about to die. And then again in verse 6, he says, but you brought me up from corruption. He's talking about, but Lord, you're going to bring me out of this thing. You're going to bring me out of this corruption. The word corruption means something that is degenerating, like a body that's in the grave. J. Vernon McGee says, well, therefore he's dead. I say, no, his body is seeing corruption. He is having acid on his body. And as we shared in our initial study, those that have already been in the belly of the whale have come out with physical evidence of damage upon them. And so we need to understand that when he says, you will still save me from corruption, means I'm not going to die, and you're going to save me from being in the grave and rotting like all the bodies do. Verse 7, he says, and this to me is the capstone, he says, when my soul fainted within me, when I was about to expire, when I had given up all hope, when I was about to die, then I remembered the Lord. That's pretty impressive, that you could spend this time in the belly of the whale, and we're not sure how long he's talking about here, but he was there 3 days and 3 nights. How long before he started to call upon the Lord? We know that he started to call upon the Lord when he realized the affliction that was on him and the suffering that he was going through. But he said, I remembered the Lord. In the depths of my despair, I remembered the Lord. Then verse 8 is a strange verse that most commentators do not understand. I want to suggest an interpretation that I think is valid here. He said, only those who arrogantly refuse the discipline of the Lord forsake mercy. If you put it in those terms, you can understand what he is saying. I came to my senses and I realized it's running from God and trying to hide from his presence is ridiculous. That's a vain vanity. That's a stupid idea. It doesn't work. And anyone that continues that pathway are going to forsake the Lord's mercy. Now he calls on the Lord for mercy. And verse 9, he says, salvation is of the Lord. He acquiesces. He gives up. And he says, Lord, I need your help. Only you can deliver me from this affliction and from death itself. You read the passage yourself and go through and see if it doesn't describe a man that's very much alive, very much feeling the agony of death. He is almost dying in the belly of the whale. Which makes me wonder, have you ever had an experience in which you almost died? Perhaps you almost drowned. Or you had a near-death experience or an accident where you were severely injured and you were left with corruption, with damaged bones and bruises. Now that's Jonah. He's feeling the adversity that was on him, the chastening of the Lord that was here. Now I want to draw some parallels. J. Vernon McGee draws the parallel that Jesus was 3 days and 3 nights in the earth, and Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale. Therefore, Jonah needs to be resurrected just like Jesus did. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus he limited this illustration to being dead for 3 days, or being in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. His emphasis was on the 3 days and 3 nights, not on being dead, and not on being in the belly of a whale or the belly of the earth. We need to understand that. Never in the passage where Jesus explains it did he say, Jonah's like me because he had to be resurrected. That is not there at all. That's reading into the passage, and Dr. McGee knows that you don't read into the passage what is not there. So let me give you some parallels of Jonah and Jesus, and some differences between the two. Jonah was disobedient. He sinned. Jesus did not. Jonah was punished for his own sin. Jesus was not. Jonah saw corruption. That is, his body was deteriorated because of the affliction of the acids in the whale's stomach. Jesus was in the grave, but he did not suffer corruption. He was raised incorruptible. Jonah was in the fish 3 days and 3 nights, and yes, Jesus was in the grave 3 days and 3 nights. That's the only parallel. And finally, Jesus descended into hell. Jonah did not.